In every field, but especially in enterprise, opportunity comes at industry inflection points. I think the present and the future of open source is building communities. Open source in my mind means less and less a bunch of software written in some language and more people that work together to achieve a common goal.
You're listening to the EnterpriseReady podcast, a show aiming to change the enterprise software narrative from how to sell to enterprises to how to build for enterprises. We'll interview industry experts and enterprise software founders as we break through the jargon, establish a common vernacular, and share the lessons learned from building the world's best enterprise software. Hi, I'm Grant Miller, creator of EnterpriseReady and founder and CEO of Replicated, where we enable cloud-native software vendors like HashiCorp, CircleCI, Sneak, and many others to operationalize and scale the distribution of their modern on-prem applications. Check us out at replicated.com. The EnterpriseReady podcast is brought to you by Heavybit, a program dedicated to helping startups take their developer products to market. For more information, visit heavybit.com. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic, or just learn more about enterprise features, find us at enterpriseready.io.
In this episode of the EnterpriseReady podcast, Grant sits down with Loris Degioanni, co-founder and CTO of Sysdig. Loriss is a pioneer in the world of open source, having been one of the creators of Wireshark, the network protocol analyzer now being used by tens of millions. They discuss Loriss's early days building open source network analyzers, which would eventually lead to Wireshark and an acquisition by Riverbed Technologies. At Riverbed, Loris talks of his initial entry into the world of enterprise software and the lessons that he took away, such as the importance of product management and building products for the customer instead of just instinct. Loris goes on to talk about the creation of Sysdig and why he decided to bet on containerization and Kubernetes in their early days. This leads to a discussion about the mindset necessary to create a compelling vision in tech and the gambles that come along with that. Finally, they discuss the future of open source and the communities that will inevitably support that software. This was a really fun episode to create, and we hope that you enjoy it as much as we did making it.
All right, Loris, thank you so much for joining.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Yeah. So let's dive right in. Tell us a little bit about how, you kind of got into enterprise software and kind of what your background is.
Boy, my story is actually pretty long.
That's great. Let's hear it.
Starts actually at this point over 20 years ago, because the way I got into software and enterprise software was originally through my graduation thesis, the project that was given to me when I was still in Italy. So as a background, I am the founder and CTO of Sysdig, but Sysdig is my second company. So I assume that we'll go into the details of Sysdig later, but my first company was called Case Technologies and was the commercial entity behind an open source network analyzer called Wireshark. Actually, I started working on Wireshark, as I was saying, when I was in school, when I was at Politecnico di Torino. And this started because my professors in the computer networking class, Silvano Gai, decided that the best way to teach computer networks to students was to let the students observe the network traffic. So essentially give a network analyzer to all of the students, with the only problem that network analyzers at that point were commercial only, very expensive, and very often hardware-based. So it was absolutely unfeasible to have essentially one for each desk in the lab so that students could just capture some network traffic and see what happened. So he asked me and other students to start working on building an open source network analyzer. And the first thing that you need to do, of course, we had Windows in the labs. And the first thing that needed to be done was to build a packet capture driver for Windows. So a piece of software that would allow a Windows workstation to be connected to a network and collect all of the traffic, sniffing all of the traffic on that network. That project was called WinPickup, and was essentially the first open source networking packet capture driver for Windows. And by the time I got my degree 6 months later, it was generating more traffic than the rest of the university combined. So that was noticed inside and outside the university, and initially got me essentially an offer to continue staying with the university and doing a PhD. And then later on, spawned my first company called Case Technologies, which was started in 2005.
That's amazing. Okay, so Wireshark, I think, is probably the more well-known. Is that right? Is that kind of the more well-known project that came out of it?
Yes, so let's continue the story. What happened?
Yeah.
What happened is that while doing my PhD on this Win Pickup, on this packet capture driver for Windows, this guy called Gerald Combs in Kansas City had built an open source network analyzer for Solaris called Ethereal. This was 2001, something like that. Gerald saw that I had finally made it possible to essentially capture packets from Windows, and saw that I had ported TCP dump to Windows using this technology. And so he decided to make a Windows version of Ethereal that would be based on Win Pickup. And that caused the overnight explosion of both Ethereal and Win Pickup. So these projects kept growing for a few years until when I moved to the United States, I was invited essentially as a PhD visitor student to California, to UC Davis. And while I was there, essentially, I told Gerald, why don't we start a company together, and we commercialize this. And Ethereal at the point was extremely well known and was the de facto open source network analyzer that everybody was starting using. And so the idea was, why don't we create a company that can essentially build products around Ethereal and around Win Pickup? The only problem was we didn't own the brand and the website domain of Ethereal. This was owned by Gerald's previous employer. And we were at that point poor, not far from being out of school, unprepared for running businesses, and unequipped for a negotiation, essentially, to acquire these assets to start the company. So what did we do? In May of 2016, we forked the Ethereal project. We renamed it into Wireshark. We told the community we'll keep working on this. We're building a company around this. We'll have our back, but the project is moving. Ethereal will stay there, but we won't maintain it anymore. And Wireshark is the new, open source network analyzer. And that started as a simple branch of Ethereal. And then, Wireshark is still what we have now, 14 years later, still thriving with millions of users. And as you probably know, has grown quite a bit since then. To give people context, maybe not everybody's technical or into network packets, but Wireshark at this point is a tool with tens of millions of users in the world and hundreds of thousands of monthly download. And everybody that does anything with a computer network, ranging from troubleshooting, security, forensics, protocol development, equipment installation, everybody, that does anything with a network uses Wireshark. And that was born just because, we had to change the name of a tool because we couldn't own the assets of the tool. So that's the power of open source, if you want.
I love that. That's amazing. And what was your co-founder's name for the Wireshark? Jared?
Gerald Combs.
Okay, great. So you met and, you had both been working on these sort of independent open source projects. Your projects were complementary, and so you formed together to create Wireshark. Mm-hmm. And did you start the company around it at exactly at that point? Like, is that when Case was launched?
We started the company together with another co-founder called John Bruno, which is the professor who invited me as a PhD student to UC Davis. So it was interesting because I had never had a job. I was still a student before, while John had spent his whole career in academia and was essentially a tenured professor. But neither of us, nor Gerald, had any experience at all in business. And that was really, really the very first job that I had was starting a company. So I always find it unique that the first time somebody gave me a salary for working was years later after my company was acquired, essentially. And at that point, I became an employee of another company. But I started essentially case just out of my PhD. And I started it with absolutely zero experience. Myself and my co-founder, absolutely zero experience in anything related to business, especially enterprise business. And for the same reason, as you can imagine, we started the company without investors. No one for sure would have been crazy enough to give us money at that point. So this was a truly, like old school, no investment, no VC kind of bootstrap company that survived and grew probably more like because of miracles than actual, strategy or skills by the founders.
But you had technical acumen and you had all these people using Wireshark. And so I'm guessing some number of those were companies who were asking you were they doing like kind of support contracts? Were you doing like...
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. So we had, the technical skills. We had a big community that we were bringing with us, which, again, it's a very interesting lesson that I learned. The fact that even when you're giving away your software for free, and you do that for years, you are creating value, and you are creating, if your software is quality and you treat your community well, you're creating essentially an ecosystem, a community that then will stay with you when you start a company and when you start selling products or services. Because the way we started definitely was by doing consultancy and selling services. When you don't have an investment from VC and you want to bring in income, typically you leverage your skills and your intellectual property to offer services to other companies. In particular, the way we started that adventure was in the avionics space. So networks, computer networks for airplanes. And in particular, we participated to the Airbus A380 development, but especially we were pretty heavily involved in the Boeing 787 development and the complexity of these modern airplanes that have proper networking and hubs and switches in the airplane instead of just having cables that connect every single device that need to talk to another device. So there was essentially an element of complexity in that industry that was matching our skills very well. And for the first couple of years, essentially, we brought revenue to the company largely by doing this kind of consultancies and growing essentially this consultancy business to bring enough money to pay for modest salaries for us and to invest into hiring employees that then we could in turn direct to help us build our own products that we started selling a couple of years later.
And then Riverbed came knocking. And did you talk a little bit about what happened there?
So we were miraculously able to grow the business pretty nicely. And in a matter of, a few years, 3-4 years, we were in the millions of yearly revenues. And this was largely based on trying to keep our open source properties and ecosystems strong, investing heavily into these open source tools like Wireshark and WinPickup, but at the same time building products that would be the periphery of this ecosystem, like USB adapters for Wi-Fi packet capture. So in other words, solutions to monitor and troubleshoot wireless networks, or devices that you could plug into data center networks and could collect traffic at high speeds for a long time so that you could go investigate and understand what the problems are. So we started building these products, and we were at that point still without any kind of investment. So independent company, generating revenue, growing pretty nicely. The team at that point was 20 or 30 people. As you can imagine, we were a pretty nice acquisition target. We received several offers, and we always decided to pass because we were having fun doing what we were doing, when a company called Riverbed, based in San Francisco, came and knocked to our door, that was different because the founder of that company, called Steve McCann, was also one of the pioneers in our industry. And when he was in school, actually, he wrote some seminal pieces of software and some seminal papers, for example, related to TCP dump and lib pickup and this kind of stuff that was really like how I was formed, as an engineer. So I thought the opportunity to work with him and his team and grow the thing together would have been, fun and exciting. And my co-founders shared that opinion. And so we ended up being acquired by Riverbed in 2010. And interesting piece of trivia, since Grant, that you just had a baby, this transaction happened truly while I was having my twins, my first two kids. And I remember I was, at the hospital with Stacy, my wife, and my co-founders were knocking on the door asking me to sign paperwork because we were essentially really at the last inches of the acquisition while we were at the hospital with Stacy, and Stacy was, ready to to deliver our twins. So that was definitely a memorable, intense, very intense time of my life.
I can't imagine. That's hilarious. And what were they acquiring it because like they saw the opportunity to really scale out these products that you had been building? Was it more about the open source community? What was the most exciting asset for them?
I think it's a combination. So Riverbed was at that point a company that had been extremely successful with their primary business, which was WAN acceleration. So simplifying, when you have a network that is connecting, for example, two offices or a data center of an office, you can put these devices at the two ends of the network and they will optimize. They will do compression, they will do optimizations, and they will essentially save you bandwidth and so save you money. And they did very well with that product line, extremely well, to the point that they went public in like 4 years or something like that. And by the time they acquired us, they were looking for essentially differentiate our business and move into new spaces. And performance management and monitoring and visibility and troubleshooting was one of the spaces. And we brought our product line there. And it was a very exciting and very formative journey for me, for sure. First of all, because as I told you before, for the first time, somebody gave me money to work, which I found to be amazing, But also because I learned a lot by being part, of a team of really skilled people, and of a company that was much bigger than mine. And we had a really nice success story there because our products essentially were put in the hands of, our sales force when we were acquired was tiny, a handful of people, while Riverbed had a solid, structured, widespread, sales force. And with global reach. So our technology was pretty good. So immediately the revenues of our products skyrocketed. And I remember, by the time I joined Riverbed, case with our products, we were generating around probably, $4 or $5 million of revenue. By the time I left Riverbed 2 years later, the revenues of that product line were like directionally toward $100 million. So a very nice success story there.
Wow.
A very nice win-win proposition, a very exciting journey, because then when you're successful, you get visibility inside the company and you can accomplish stuff. And of course, the merit was everybody in the business unit, but just was, very successful and very fun. And I spent 2 years there, and those were, 2 years in which I learned definitely a lot.
Yeah, that's amazing. I sort of had a slightly similar experience. I'm guessing is that where you sort of really picked up what enterprise customers wanted, and you saw how an enterprise go-to-market really worked, and you sort of saw how like these big organizations and support teams, and is that kind of where you got a taste for how to really structure an enterprise software company and enterprise software go-to-market?
Big time. I mean, without that experience, without what I learned in terms of what is an enterprise customer? What is the journey, of selling or even of building a product for an enterprise customer? What does it mean, to have a lifelong relationship with that customer? Because at that point already, and even more now, with the recurrent business models, your customer is your partner, forever, and the relationship that you need to establish with the customer, and what support is, what customer success is, what pre-sales and post-sales are. All of these I learned at Riverbed, and I was lucky enough to learn it from one of the best teams. And, that was eye-opening. I had no idea all of this stuff existed.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It really is. You probably thought, hey, I built this great company. We got, 4 or 5 million in revenue. We started from nothing. We look what we've done. And then you kind of watch it in the hands of a bigger company, and they have the full machinery kind of going, where they know how to roll things out and their customers know how to sell stuff and position it. Yeah, it really is.
The machinery is something that I just had no idea it even existed, before. It's probably many people that maybe start with their little companies and then they go into enterprise later, It's a bunch of stuff, all very important, that needs to operate in harmony, and it's not trivial.
Yeah. Did you kind of develop any almost like frameworks, or, if you distill some of the things you learned, right? Like, were there any kind of key lessons or stories, from that time that sort of were formative as you moved in to start Sysdig?
Many of them. One is what I just mentioned, so the customer journey, right? So what is, the journey of you as a software provider and the customer need to do together for the company actually to be successful. The other one is the role and importance of product management. Before that, my products were built more like on instinct, starting from something cool and definitely technology driven. I'm pretty skilled at, identifying gaps, technological gaps, and building, maybe exciting stuff around these technological gaps. But that's just a part of the equation. Understanding your customer, understanding the market, reading the signals, using the right metrics and informing your decisions. That's all stuff that I learned how to do by essentially observing very good people doing that at Riverbed. Maybe one last thing that I learned it about myself, which was I am an entrepreneur. So despite loving working for a bigger company, I was really craving just going back and being, again, the true owner of my future, which happens only if you have your own company.
Very true. Okay, so going back to these two lessons, this idea of product management, it's funny because I think about, as early founders and early sort of like product people, you have these ideas. And I think you talked about this as identifying the gaps, right? And these sort of like, oh, this is a technical gap and we could do something cool here, which is a skill, upon itself. But then this idea of then taking that and really finding a market opportunity around it, I think is, a much larger skill. And that's often why companies exist, to sort of go find that. So is there like an example of some of the technology that maybe you sold into Riverbed or even at Sysdig, of sort of how, you had this cool technology, but then the steps you took to really understand the customer or the market or find the right metrics along the way?
I need to think because I have so many examples. But to give you an example that is more recent, so I'm jumping a little bit in history.
Great.
And I'm jumping to the current Sysdig product line.
Mm-hmm.
But Sysdig offers products to run essentially containerized and Kubernetes and cloud infrastructures in production. And we have a monitoring and visibility product line, and we also have a security product line. The security product line is relatively recent. We launched it in 2017, essentially spawned from the core technology that Sysdig had developed initially for monitoring and visibility. And when building that product, we talked to people, we talked to users, and we did as much market research as we could. And we identified essentially a set of features that we put in the first version of the product. This set of features were revolving more based on, my inclination as a technologist on the harder runtime security and protection kind of features. So stuff like anomaly detection, like ability to detect threats for containerized infrastructures and so on. And we didn't include initially technology that we consider to be much more trivial and less differentiated, like CI/CD pipeline scanning. So essentially, being able to look at your applications as they are built by your continuous integration pipeline, and being able to find anomalies or issues or security vulnerabilities at that level. So we sort of snapped that feature because it was not very differentiated and it was sort of too easy. And we started selling the product, and the product started selling pretty nicely. But immediately, the users started screaming to having also the less sexy functionality, because you want the sexy stuff, but you absolutely also want to have the checkboxes. Otherwise, the product is not fully useful for you. So we had to scramble, modify our trajectory and go and include, the scanning stuff, the non-sexy stuff. And the moment we did the release, the product exploded overnight. So that taught me that, first of all, listen to your customers. Try to do possibly as early as possible, even before you start building. But if you cannot do that, maybe because you don't have the resources, keep listening, and keep bringing this information and inform your decision as effectively and quickly as possible after the product is out, so you can quickly modify your roadmap to consistently match what you're hearing. And that can make a huge, huge difference.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm glad you touched on Sysdigs. I think we should jump there, and then maybe we'll come back to some of these other things you learned along the way as well. But let's talk about it. So you said the final thing you learned was you're an entrepreneur, and working for a bigger company isn't really, your style. So, talk about what inspired you to launch Sysdig. What was the aha moment, and how did it go?
I think that in every field, but especially in enterprise, opportunity comes at industry inflection points, right? Because it's uncommon to convince this enterprise to replace this tool with something else that is marginally better. At the same time, when something new happens, when physical servers become virtual machines, when data center becomes cloud, when software that is packaged, with an operating system becomes a container, those are moments of radical change where you can find an insertion point. So I left Riverbed in 2012, and I took a little bit of a break. But around the time, first of all, cloud computing was in its phase of explosion, and a company, a little PaaS provider called .cloud was being renamed into Docker, and the container revolution was born. So that was really, coinciding almost exactly with me essentially leaving Riverbed and looking for new adventures. So the impetus for me was take what I learned before, the type of functionality and technology from an industry that I had helped shaping, and realizing that that kind of technology, despite being very useful, despite clearly having a value for the enterprise, realizing that it was not going to be applicable anymore, because there was a technological shift that was making it architecturally not really applicable. And at the same time, this technological shift would generate a new greenfield market that was big enough for a new player to essentially go and and grab that market. So a mix of technology opportunity and greenfield in the market. And I thought, this sounds exciting. Let's see if we can do something.
Yeah, I mean, I think we first met out at DockerCon, but I think we met someone from your team at a CoreOS event, just around the founding, it was very, very early containerization.
CoreOS, the conference, yes.
CoreOS Fest, right, exactly.
That was, 2015, I believe, yes.
Yeah, so, you'd started the company a couple of years before, and, you were really kind of getting things, off the ground at that point around containerization. What made you think, it's interesting, I think we look at it now, and it's pretty obvious that, the containerization and Kubernetes have shifted the market probably in an order of magnitude, maybe 2 orders of magnitude more than we expected. But why were you confident that this was a technology shift that was worth building a company around?
I was not confident at all. I mean, I was projecting conviction, to the external world. But the reality is you make a bet, and that, in my opinion, is the key moment when you approach the market the way I just described. There are many ways to go to market, but when you are essentially looking for a major inflection in a big industry like enterprise IT, you need to jump early and you need to make a bet early before everybody else is seeing it, right? So containers at that point, especially pre-Kubernetes, you remember the times when, it was just, Docker, and then Mesos came, and then Kubernetes came. It sounded very exciting. It sounded technologically the right approach, and the approach that should be used in the future. But it was absolutely a bet. And, part of being an entrepreneur is making informed bets. Of course, you don't want to make stupid bets, but still you are making bets, and there's an intrinsic element of luck, and containers went exactly where we predicted, probably surpassing our predictions. And it's easy now, and I should probably, come here to you and present myself as the genius visionary that saw this before everybody else. But in honest truth, I made an early bet on something that felt like it had potential of being, a radical change in the market, and that bet fortunately paid off.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think it's funny because I think it kind of matters who else is betting alongside of you, right? I think part of the reason that this has become so successful is because the ecosystem is here. So, because containers existed and companies started betting on it, and Google bet on it with Kubernetes and open sourcing that, it then opens up the market even more, and then more people bet on it, and Red Hat bets. It's everybody kind of, starts to back it, and it gains momentum and sort of becomes self-fulfilling.
Yeah. And philosophically, for sure, around those days, I was more interested in being the leader in a tiny market with opportunity rather than a little player into a much bigger market, but with less growth opportunity. So that was the philosophy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense as well, right? Because maybe there's a different way to do it, but I think growing a company as the market is growing feels like the easiest way to do it, because the large competitors are sort of scared away from these tiny markets. And that for you, you're the market's bigger than my company is, so there's room for me to grow. Mm-hmm. And then you're I believe that this market will continue to grow in the future. And then if I'm right, I'll be able to take up as much space as it grows.
If you're right, by the time your competitors realize this market is important, you've already taken off.
Yeah, exactly. So obviously one of the bets was on, containerization and, eventually Kubernetes. Were there other bets that were kind of part of your early thesis? You're maybe it was the world will use more apps, or just anything else that was kind of part of the story?
Yeah, I would say from the technology point of view, nowadays they call it shift left, right? Or DevOps. Mm-hmm. But in a general way, the CI/CD pipeline becoming more and more important. more and more like the center around which you build software. So a higher level depiction of this is traditional software was built in a monolithic, giant, pieces of code that were released in a pretty manual way every 6, 12, 18 months. Nowadays, software is split into components, microservices, built continuously. So every time a developer makes a change in the code is built and released automatically. It's built, it's tested, and then it's released. So describing this nowadays is like absolutely normal. No one would be crazy enough to build software in a different way. But when we were talking about, 5, 6, 7, 10 years ago, that was absolutely not the norm yet. So this movement of, let's say, DevOps and CI/CD and shift left and microservices is another big bet that we did from the technology point of view. So the Sysdig product line is not only specialized in, let's say, containers and Docker and Kubernetes, but in everything that has to do with like the way you architect and structure modern software, especially modern software that runs on the cloud. That's another conscious bet that we made early on during the life of Sysdig, and that still drives, our strategy nowadays.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense as well. Sort of this focus on DevOps and sort of the move towards cloud native, both architecture as well as deployment targets. That makes a ton of sense to me. And saying we're going to build towards those things and build the tooling that sort of captures those trends and build a business on top of those.
And the pattern is the one that I was mentioning before, identify something that has the potential to be revolutionary.
Yeah.
And make the existing tools that people use not functional anymore. CI/CD. So even intuitively, even if you're not into writing and shipping software, it's intuitive that, tools that are designed to whatever, secure or visualize software that is released every 18 months are very different, radically different from tools that are designed to do the same with software that is shipped 20 times a day.
Yeah.
So clearly, if a change in that direction happens, then people will need new solutions and will need new vendors.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because I didn't know that there was going to be multiple here, but I sort of assumed there would, because I sort of have a belief that any decent company is actually making multiple bets, right? You're saying, I think that these 4 things will be true in the future. And if like 3 of those 4 things are true, like you might build like a $100 million company. If 4 of them are true, you build a $1 billion company. And if 2 of them are true, you get acquired for $20 million. And if 1 of them's true, you're out of business. And if 0 of them are true, like you've literally just gone the opposite direction of the entire ecosystem, and everyone wonders what you did wrong. But that's sort of, you have to have it's more than just one bet. It's you have to place a couple bets and sort of predict the future. Does that map onto what you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if you have the ambition of building the company of a certain size, right?
Yeah.
Let's say in order to generate, $1 billion company, your predictions about multiple things in the future need to be pretty accurate.
Yeah. Yep.
Right?
And you need to kind of constantly tune those predictions as things become more clear, right? And sort of keep making predictions.
That is constant. That never stops. Yeah. That happens always, or at least in my experience, that's happened always on a weekly basis, Not even on a monthly basis. But especially when you're working on the bleeding edge in ecosystems like the cloud native one, there's really, something new every day. There's a new technology every day. There's a new direction every day. There's a new cloud every day. So it's constant refinement. But the initial assumptions are still important. It's like chaos theory.
Yeah, exactly. Do you believe that the, not trajectory, but sort of that, you were talking about this cadence of every day in the cloud native space, there was like a new project, a new thing, a new, I felt like it was very hard to keep up with. Do you feel like it's stabilized a bit in the last year or two?
So I feel like it's a wave on top of each other, right? So some things stabilize, like we were remembering things like CoreOS Fest, in 2015. At that point, it was absolutely not clear if, first of all, the container market would have been a big market at all. But even assuming it would be, there was Kubernetes, there was Docker Swarm, there was Mesos, and all of them.
I mean, I think even at that point, CoreOS had one called Fleet, I think, right? So
Yes.
OpenShift wasn't yet Kubernetes.
Which was,
exactly.
Yeah. So it was so much in flux, So that part of the ecosystem is stabilized quite a bit thanks to the fact that Kubernetes and the stack around Kubernetes has become the winner and is the default one. So from the point of view of like the orchestrator, we are in a much more stable place, but there's something new going on all the time. Like, I don't know, network meshes, tooling around it, and I don't know, like Sysdig is active in the security space, so anything related to security in the Kubernetes ecosystem, and the Falcos and Dopas and all of these tools, there's something new every day. There are new ideas. There's continuous innovation and continuous adoption of new tools. The Prometheus and OpenTelemetry, OpenCensus, they're still, even in the visibility space, which is the other area where Sysdig is active, there's still quite a bit of stuff going on. So it's almost like as the fundamental base pieces stabilize and slow down a little bit, the pieces on top of them, there's always something new that happens and that accelerates.
Yeah, that's a great point. So you talk about these platform shifts, that sort of come about, I think about that sort of shift in technology that creates an opportunity for a company. As some of those stabilize, that allows the companies and the ecosystem around it to sort of even go faster. I think, a lot of folks were on the sidelines waiting to come into the cloud native ecosystem until there was kind of a clear winner. But now the sort of innovation is happening a little bit higher in the stack in different sides like security, or I guess like tooling, you're saying, just anything beyond just the standard, like the core bits that drive it underneath the hood.
Service meshes are a very good example of that, something with huge promise for the future, almost as revolutionary as Kubernetes itself, but definitely still very much in the early stages and with a lot of continuous change coming in the space. Another area that comes to my mind is containers and Kubernetes in the cloud, right? So every cloud provider now is heavily investing in Kubernetes, and each of them has their own flavors, like for example the Fargates in AWS and so on, and there's a ton of work that is done there, and the landscape is quite fluid still.
Yeah, it's interesting how these evolve, but then new areas pop up, and that's where new opportunities come in for all of us to sort of investigate and to introduce.
Yeah, hopefully this gives ideas to listeners to start their own companies.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's part of this, right? Like hearing about how we think about, identifying opportunities. This is what part of the goal is, right? Like, let's explore how we think about these things.
Yeah.
So with Sysdig, your initial product, right, was sort of more around monitoring and observability. That was the core, and you still have that as a product.
Yeah.
Was it open source from the very get-go or not?
Part of it was open source. So
okay.
From that point of view, we can say that Sysdig, my second company, is largely an evolution of what I did with my first company, the Wireshark one, Case Technologies, reapplying the technology and the lessons of the first adventure to the new world, to the changing world of cloud and containers. And the underlying technology in my first company, and the underlying, actually more than technology, data source for my first company was packets, network packets. So the unit of transfer on a wire or wireless, if you're using a wireless network. That unit is not very suitable for the modern world of containers and cloud computing. So what we did was we focused on other data sources, and we ended up picking system calls. So instead of looking only at the network traffic, a system call is everything that a piece of software does when running somewhere. Like opening a file is a system call, communicating on a network is a system call, executing a command is a system call. So all of these signals, we built software to essentially collect them and treat them a little bit like network packets so that you could capture them, you could filter them, you could save them, and so on. So we essentially found a data source that would be suitable and applicable to the modern world of containers and cloud, but we could use the powerful workflows that we knew were working for the previous generation of the industry. And that brought us to the creation of an open source tool called Sysdig, which then gave the name to the company and was the first thing that we released at Sysdig as a company. You could almost describe it as a Wireshark for system calls and for containers and for cloud computing. For that reason, we adopted an open source approach, exactly like we did with Wireshark before. Sysdig is still, a very popular open source tool, which is broadly used in the community for troubleshooting, forensics, incident response for containerized infrastructures. This was the core piece of technology. And on top of this, we built Sysdig Monitor, which essentially uses the same data collection, the same rich data collection technology, but instead of focusing on the troubleshooting, forensics workflows, and so on, more like a single machine, single container kind of workflows, Sysdig Monitor is more like an end-to-end visibility tool that you deploy on every single machine, on every single piece of software, and that can collect the data from all of these sources in a centralized way and give you metrics, visibility, dashboard, and all of this kind of stuff. So it's almost like the core technology for both products is open source, but then we have an open source tool that is for the community, and then we have a distributed commercial tool, which is commercial and for our paying customers.
Right. You followed that same model with the Falco product and project as well, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And if Sysdig was inspired by a tool like Wireshark, Falco was inspired more by tools like Snort, so intrusion detection systems that were, again, purely networking tools that we evolved to containers. So again, nothing is reinvented, or at least we didn't reinvent anything. We tried to get the best ideas that were working and useful for people in the previous generation, and we essentially did the technological steps to make them useful and valuable in the next generation.
Okay, that makes sense to me. And so, that's another interesting sort of like framework for thinking about products is, what was useful before and like what's changed and how do we bring this into the new world, right?
To me, that's what I've always done.
Yeah.
And to me, it's a much more effective and less risky and more potentially successful way to build a business. I'm totally aware that you can go and essentially create a market, create a category by yourself single-handedly. But identifying a category that is working in a specific area or industry and finding a way to port this category, this technology in a different industry is one of the safest and potentially successful ways to do business, especially in the enterprise.
Yeah. And then, from an open source perspective, realistically, Wireshark and the work you did there to commercialize that was pretty early in the open source journey. And even when you started Sysdig, I think there was likely much less sort of known about how to build and scale an open source business. We didn't have like the HashiCorps and GitLabs that were running, these huge companies at that point. So, did you ever consider not doing open source? Was it really obvious to you from the beginning? And then talk a little bit about like sort of what it provides in terms of value to you as a business and how you interact with the community.
Yeah, so at that stage, we're really talking about very, very early days at Sysdig. So at this stage, as an entrepreneur, you have a tension between building valuable and differentiated and protectable, I don't know if protectable is a word, but intellectual property.
Seems good to me.
Exactly. And being known by the world, having the world know that you exist. So the intellectual property protection pushes you against open source because especially if you're building something powerful and valuable and hard, why giving it away, and giving it away to the community, giving it away potentially also to your competitors. The need of having the world know you pushes you toward open source because open source is one of the best generators of brand and visibility and virality that one can imagine, especially in enterprise software, especially when you're targeting DevOps, developers, and the highly technical audience. So to me, reason number one to do open source at that point was like, I'm a pre-Series A company. I have big ambitions. No one knows about me. How do I show the world who I am? How do I make the world understand and appreciate what I'm doing? And that's why we decided to release some of our IP, actually the vast majority of our IP, and have open source Sysdig released in 2014. That bootstrapped our company in terms of being known by the world, and that sort of generated, our Series A of funding because the thing went viral.
Yeah, it's interesting. So off the back of sort of some open source adoption, you then were able to raise. Did you raise a seed round before that or not?
We did raise a seed round before that, yes.
Great.
The seed round was in 2013, and the A round came at the end of 2014. Yeah, thanks to the fact that everybody at this point in our segment was talking about us because we had released this very useful and cool open source tool.
Great. And then, you raised the A, you start to build. And then when did you decide that you were, okay, we're really selling the enterprise. We need to get in here and get, all these features like role-based access control and, on-prem deployment and all these kind of stuff. Like when did that become part of the roadmap?
Yeah, that's interesting because my thesis was that containers and Kubernetes being, the bleeding edge of the bleeding edge would follow the same pattern that cloud computing followed in terms of penetration. So cloud computing and clouds like AWS started by being adopted by, startups, small bleeding edge organizations, little rogue teams inside the enterprise. And only years and years later, a decade later, they were actually, accepted at scale by most of the enterprises. And there was quite a bit of just a long-term Silicon Valley adoption of cloud technologies before it became mainstream. So we were convinced it would be the same with containers. So we started by preparing ourselves essentially to sell to small and medium enterprises, actually very small and small enterprises. We found out after going out, in the market and started selling our product that Kubernetes and microservices were something that was more appealing to bigger organizations, especially the biggest organizations like banks, media companies, television providers, healthcare, these kind of insurances, this kind of companies, in addition to the Silicon Valley startups. So as we started going out and equipping ourselves essentially to sell this and do our steps for product market fit, we were, I wouldn't say caught off guard, but a little bit surprised by the fact that these started looking more and more like an enterprise business, like a set of technologies that the enterprise would be interested in. So despite starting, early on, equipped with, just a go-to-market engine that would focus on small organizations, we pretty quickly pivoted into bigger organizations as customers because, again, we were pulled into that.
I love that. Yeah. So it's interesting because you're like that was actually one of these bets that maybe you were initially wrong, but you were able to move fast enough and say, oh, our ideal customer profile is not small team. It's actually these much larger organizations who are thinking about scale and using Kubernetes to manage lots of different services across lots of different teams.
Absolutely. And definitely, I don't know if I would say a wrong bet or an assumption that seemed to be pretty reasonable at the time that turned out not to be right. And I think it's not uncommon in that phase. And yes, the solution for that is being able to react quickly when an assumption that you've made turns out not to be true.
Yeah, and I think it's also likely very helpful that you had spent that time at Riverbed and really learned what enterprises needed, and you had been selling to that customer. So I'm guessing, a different founder who didn't have that sort of, real enterprise experience, they think they're going to sell to small businesses like them and these, high growth companies. Mm-hmm. Then they start to realize that the inbound is from these bigger companies and they have no idea how to manage that or sell to it. It's a harder transition. But because you had the experience at Riverbed, I'm guessing you were able to see the signals a little bit faster and react and actually know how to handle those customers, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I was saying there would be no Sysdig now if I hadn't learned those lessons while at Riverbed, for sure.
Yeah. And so let's kind of fast forward a little bit into the companies. Now you've been around for a few years, and Falco seems like it's a really important part of the company, and you made a different decision with open sourcing that, in that you didn't just open source it and act as the key maintainers, but you actually donated it to the CNCF, correct?
That is correct. And the rationale there is, again, trying to read essentially where the industry is going and try to make the right bets and assumptions for the future. The assumption here is that we are going through a radical change in approach to cloud computing. It's almost like stage 2 of cloud computing. Stage 1 was Amazon, Microsoft, Google, IBM building their clouds and offering essentially services on top of their clouds. Phase 2 is this sort of computing stack for the cloud is being created that sort of sits on top of the clouds and acts as a agnostic operating system for the cloud. And the unique, very powerful thing about this stack is that it's completely open and community driven, which means that the units to run your software, like the container engine, like Docker, the orchestrator, like Kubernetes, these are all essentially open source, but also everything that revolves around them, like storage, networking, firewalling, you name it, it's all open source and community driven. So 5 years from now, 10 years from now, that will be the default stack, which means that in order to be relevant and the winner as a vendor 5 years from now, you will have to be part of the stack because you have contributed, essentially creating the stack. And that happens only if you do that with the community. So we sort of realized as Sysdig that if we have ambitions to be the security company for Kubernetes and for the cloud, we cannot do this as a single company, but we need to do it by driving this, by being the thought leader together with the rest of the community, by essentially having the technology underneath it being essentially truly part of the Kubernetes stack because it's part of the CNCF. So essentially, we took the decision of donating all of this valuable intellectual property to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation so that we can drive this not as a company, but as a community, and we can make sure runtime security is an integral part of Kubernetes, and runtime security is based on what we believe is the right technological approach because we've built it with our conviction, and if the community embraces it, that means we were true.
Yeah, I love that. That's actually really interesting sort of perspective in long term too, which is really important. And it's something that we think about at Replicated, right? Like we donated the project recently called Schema Hero, which isn't core to our business. I think it was, it's sort of this, interesting piece of technology that my co-founder built and we thought would be really well designed and well suited to be part of the CNCF. But it's interesting to hear how you talk about that and sort of thinking about, long term, like what do you want to make sure is sort of aligned with your product vision that's part of this ecosystem?
Yeah, and as an entrepreneur, you always need to take into account, long-term play versus short-term play, right? So something like an open source approach is, again, probably damaging in the short term because you release intellectual property that is yours to the community and to your competitors. But it's a winning strategy in the long term, especially in dynamics like the ones where I described, where the stack is becoming open, because it allows you to build much better solutions that are much better integrating with the stack and much more embraced by the community. And Sysdig here is, knowingly playing the long-term game, but, what you do heavily depends on what you want to optimize for your company. If you want to be acquired next week, probably that's not the right choice.
Yeah, sure. I'm guessing like potentially some of this was informed by how you saw Prometheus perform compared to some of the core Sysdig technologies. Is that right?
Yeah, with Prometheus, it's interesting because definitely, Sysdig was already offering monitoring tools before Prometheus, but that's an area where it was pretty clear, the community wanted a standard. That's exactly what I was describing. The next generation computing stack is going to be open and is going to be standard and is going to be driven by the community. So clearly, as a monitoring vendor, the right choice for us was to embrace this and to try to work together with the community and at the same time offer something that can sit on top of the standard for monitoring, which is Prometheus, and offer full compatibility on it, but with enterprise functionality. And right now, the reason why people buy Sysdig as a monitoring tool is because we have the most scalable, more enterprise ready, more complete monitoring software that is fully 100% compatible and host swappable with what the community offers. So Falco on one side and Prometheus on the other side really sort of are the cornerstone of our strategy and how we are essentially positioning a platform that is ready for the enterprise, but very much based on standards that are open, community-driven, and allow our customers to use us or use, a completely home-built solution in a way that is completely compatible.
It's interesting. I'm just sort of thinking about like this evolution of open source, right? And so at first it was like, just even open sourcing stuff was great. And then it was like open source and then actually donate the IP to a foundation.
A neutral organization, yeah.
Yeah, neutral organization. Like, is there like in 5 years, a thing that is even a step beyond, a neutral organization? Like, I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I'm wondering if you think about the future of open source, going in any direction or the other.
I think the present and the future of open source is building communities. Open source in my mind means less and less a bunch of software written in some language, and more people that work together to achieve a common goal. This is what's unique, in Kubernetes and the modern cloud computing. It's multiple companies, including the cloud providers, that are competing with each other, working together on having a standard that is, accepted by everybody and as interoperable as possible. Open source is not code and not the license that you use, but it's people, how they work together, how do they influence each other, and how do they coordinate to reach a common goal. And it will be, in my opinion, more and more like that in the future. And that is very relevant for entrepreneurs because more and more the future of enterprise software, and you name it. You were mentioning a company like HashiCorp or GitLab. I'm thinking about Kong, which recently raised almost $100 million. I'm thinking about, NGNX. I'm thinking about Cassandra. All of these companies start from open source, start by building communities, and then they find their way toward essentially commercializing commercial products around that.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's a really unique perspective. And I hadn't even thought about the idea that like it's more and more about the people, less about the code, which makes total sense because ultimately, and there's also such an important part about standards and collaboration, because if we were all just building these projects independently and open, it's not that valuable, but it's the collaboration, it's the consistency.
That's right.
It's like, and that's what allows communities, that's what allows ecosystems to evolve as well, is because then, okay, if like I know that there's consistent protocol underneath the hood, like I can place a bet on that platform and then do my thing on top of it, and maybe that's open as well. So yeah, that's a really great point.
Exactly, and there are industries that have traditionally been pretty open, like the database. It's uncommon nowadays to have a piece of backend, the Redis, MySQL, Cassandra, and so on. Elastic, to have any of these components. Elastic is a little bit recently, but they are not open source. But there are, at the same time, other industries, for example, the security industry in which Sysdig operates, that have been pretty resistant to adopt open source, and they've been more opaque. And I think one of the trends in the future is that this will change. And companies like Sysdig that approach security from the open source point of view, starting with community-driven efforts like Falco, will become the norm in security as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's we'll see more and more open source security companies over the next 5-6 years as well that really disrupt the ecosystem, because part of it is that shift left concept, right? Where like developers are getting more into security, developers expect more open source, but it's just such a powerful model, right? It's almost an unstoppable force because it just keeps rolling. And then if the end users prefer it, there's almost like it's just a war of attrition over time.
Exactly.
Cool. Loris, I mean, this has been a really kind of fantastic stroll through your career, the insights, the things you've learned, your perspectives. Is there anything else that you want to share with the audience? Maybe a bit about the future of Sysdig, or things you're excited about. I don't know, just anything you want to cap it off with.
Yeah, future of Sysdig. I wish I could, but Sysdig at this point is a strong player. I would argue Sysdig is the leading player in security for containers, Kubernetes, and cloud. We have an organization that is growing very nicely. And for the moment, together with my team, I'm still very, very excited to be part of and to keep growing. So, my first company, the Wireshark company, Case Technologies, was acquired relatively early on. And it was a great experience, very exciting. we'll see what happens with Sysdig. The future is always unknown, but with this one, my ambition, the ambition of the team is building something, big that can live long and really be a strong leader of the market. And that's what we're doing. And we're coming up with, new features, new functionality, new exciting news on a daily basis. And we hope to be able to do that for still quite a bit of time as our organization grows. The important thing, hopefully, is keeping having fun. And for the moment, I'm having a ton of it.
I love that. Yeah, and I will echo that. You do have an incredible team. I've gotten to know the folks over there for the last 5-6 years. We owe you a debt of gratitude as one of our early customers. But this has been super interesting to learn from you and hear your perspectives here. Thank you for coming on the show and kind of sharing everything.
My pleasure. It was fun.
That's all we have time for today. If you're interested in being a guest on this show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic, or just to learn more about enterprise features, find us at EnterpriseReady.io. To learn more about Heavybit, visit heavybit.com to check out the library. It's packed with amazing talks on sales, marketing, product, and general management from founders of developer tools companies and other industry leaders. This podcast is also brought to you by my company, Replicated, where we enable cloud-native software vendors like HashiCorp, CircleCI, Sneak, and many others to operationalize and scale the distribution of their modern on-prem applications to their largest enterprise customers. Check us out at replicated.com.